There is a place on the map they tried to erase, a name buried beneath layers of redacted archives and lost parish records. Ashford. Say it aloud, and the air changes. Say it twice, and something old listens, because Ashford isn't just a family name. It's a cipher, a key, a doorway. You were never meant to hear what I'm about to tell you. This is not folklore. This is not myth. This is blood history, surgically removed from the American psyche, one generation at a time. But history has a pulse, and this story has never stopped bleeding. In the dead heart of Maine, before the Civil War, before electricity kissed the soil, there stood a convent built by women who were not nuns, who served no god, and who answered to nothing but the cold order of their own design. The Ashford women did not come to heal, they came to harvest souls, secrets, minds. They built what the locals called the House of Eternal Tears. But no one cried within those stone walls, not for long, because what cried at first became silent later, and silence was the goal. Silence was always the goal. Over 600 women entered that place, less than half ever left, and those who did, they came back hollow. Something had been taken, and not just innocence, not just memory, no, something more primal, their fire, their names, their will. You see, the Ashfords weren't treating hysteria, they were testing thresholds, mapping the landscape of control, breaking a woman's spirit to see what was left afterward, not in the name of science, not in the name of salvation, but in the name of obedience, absolute, irreversible obedience. This isn't about one family, this is about a pattern that never stopped. The Ashford methods were not buried, they were adopted, codified, sterilized, renamed and exported. You live with them now, you obey them now, in your workplace, your school, your church, your marriage. This is the origin of the system that trains you to smile while being devoured. And yet, some things were too terrible to fully absorb into the machine. Some techniques were too crude, too raw, too effective. They left scars, echoes, whispers in the bone. This is where it begins, not with a murder, not with a ritual, but with 3 women stepping off a wagon in 1798, with eyes too old and smiles too smooth. Welcome to the Ashford legacy. Millbridge was a nowhere town, a smear of cabins and salt-splintered docks surrounded by forest so dense it swallowed sound. That's where they chose to arrive. October 13th, 1798. It wasn't random. Nothing about them was random. The Ashford sisters didn't find Millbridge, they selected it. A coastal outpost, miles from the nearest real authority, full of God-fearing, desperate men who respected 3 things: land, lineage, and piety. The Ashfords came offering all 3. They came with forged letters from London parishes and coins stamped with the King's seal. But those who looked close enough saw the truth hiding in plain sight. Their money was real, but old. The dates didn't match their story. The details didn't add up, but no one questioned them, because power wears a smile more convincing than truth ever could. Mother Superior Agatha was the first to step off the wagon, statuesque, serene. Her eyes scanned the town like a hawk in velvet robes. She didn't walk, she glided, and when she spoke, it was with a voice honed by decades of command. Not compassion, command. You obeyed her, even if you didn't know why. Sister Prudence was the surgeon, silent, precise. Her hands never shook, not even in winter winds. There was something reptilian about her, the way she watched people's mouths when they spoke, like studying a twitch, as if dissecting you with her gaze. And then there was Temperance, the novice, barely 22 but ancient in spirit. She was beautiful, terribly beautiful, the kind of beauty that doesn't fade because it was never meant to be real. Her skin glowed with unnatural stillness, and her eyes saw too much. She didn't smile at you, she assessed you. They claimed to be building a sanctuary, a place for troubled women to find redemption, but the blueprints told a different story, reinforced stone, drainage tunnels large enough to carry bodies, iron locks, hidden chambers, and a basement carved deeper than any frost line. The townspeople thought they were seeing the rise of a new holy order, but what they were watching was the birth of an institution built on psychological crucifixion. In every generation, there are those who hide behind God while practicing something older than religion, something colder, something that waits in the dark with tools not meant for healing. And in Millbridge, it began with gratitude. They welcomed the Ashfords with open arms, blind eyes, and eager wallets. None of them realized they were feeding a machine that would never stop chewing. 8 months. That's all it took to raise the fortress. Not a convent, not a sanctuary, a fortress. The laborers didn't question the pace because their pockets were full. Gold speaks louder than doubt. But at night, over whiskey and fire, they whispered, "What kind of church needs stone walls 3 feet thick? Why are the windows so high? Why no bells? Why the iron bars beneath the floorboards?" No answers ever came, only silence and more gold. The Ashfords supervised every detail, every nail, every beam. Sister Prudence personally oversaw the excavation of the lower levels, and what they dug was not a basement, it was a tomb that breathed. There were rooms down there that didn't match the floor plans, angles that didn't conform to geometry, a chamber that always felt colder, even in summer. No one could explain why the stone there seemed older, darker, almost slick. One mason quit halfway through, said he saw something move where no light touched. They found him 3 days later, drunk and screaming in a church pew, raving about the eye under the floor. His name was never spoken again. When the building was complete, they called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, a name whispered like a prayer or a curse. Women began arriving almost immediately. Some came willingly, clutching Bibles and hope. Others were dragged by fathers, husbands, pastors, shame disguised as salvation. They were told it was a place of healing, but it was a warehouse for the inconvenient, a dumping ground for the disobedient. What made the Ashfords different wasn't just their cruelty. It was their precision, their calm. They weren't punishing women, they were reprogramming them, breaking the will, erasing the self, extracting identity like rotting teeth. Inside those walls, women were stripped of their names, their voices, their memories. They became daughters of silence. And that silence wasn't metaphorical. Some, many, were never heard from again. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the local physician, became their willing partner. A man once considered progressive, now a courier of flesh. He brought them cases. He delivered medicine. But what he received in return were notes, charts, case studies that read like demonic scripture, observations not about healing, but control, total behavioral collapse followed by reassembly. This wasn't treatment, it was conditioning, the kind of work empires later built institutions on. What the Ashfords created in those chambers wasn't simply horror, it was a prototype, a manual, a system. And you still live in its shadow. The first woman to escape didn't speak, couldn't speak. Her name had been Margaret Langdon, a schoolteacher from Portland with a sharp tongue and a hunger for books deemed dangerous. She was sent to the convent by her brother, a minister, after she began preaching abolitionist ideas in mixed company. 3 months later, she stumbled out of the forest barefoot and blood-stained, her mouth sewn shut with black thread. The doctors who examined her were baffled, not just by the stitching, but by the fact that it had already begun to heal, as if she'd been living that way for weeks. They removed the thread carefully, expecting screams. Instead, Margaret stared blankly at the ceiling. When asked her name, she looked confused. When asked where she came from, she whispered a single word: below. She died 11 days later. Not from infection, but from dehydration. She simply refused to eat, as if something inside her had been switched off. She wasn't the last. Each season, more women disappeared behind those stone walls. Daughters who read too much, wives who spoke too loudly, women who laughed at the wrong moment or looked too long at the wrong man. They were labeled hysterics, unclean, possessed, and the Ashfords took them with open arms. But what really happened beneath the convent wasn't possession, it was possession's opposite. It was removal, hollowing. They weren't performing exorcisms, they were conducting extractions, taking something essential and replacing it with silence. Dr. Hartwell's private notes mention a procedure called the stillness method. He described it as a neurological interruption of the ego architecture, primitive lobotomy. But his language shifted over time. The soul, he began calling it, the internal compass. He believed the Ashfords had found a way to sever identity from behavior, disconnect the who from the what. You could still wail, still speak, but your decisions weren't yours anymore. Your reactions were installed. Your will became programmable. This was not healing, it was mechanization. The Ashfords weren't nuns, they were engineers of the mind, tinkering with the factory settings of womanhood to design a new obedient model. And this was over a century before lobotomies were known, decades before MK Ultra, centuries before modern psychological warfare. So let me ask you, what if the Ashfords weren't just ahead of their time? What if they were the blueprint, and the rest of the world simply followed? In the spring of 1804, the convent hosted its first public miracle. A young woman named Eliza Kempton, once known in Boston for her fiery speeches on suffrage and her refusal to marry, was returned to her family after a full year inside the Ashford institution. The woman who stood on their porch was unrecognizable. Gone were her convictions, gone was the fire, gone was her voice, except for recitations of scripture and soft apologies for causing trouble. Her father wept with joy. Her mother called it a rebirth. But her sister noticed something else. Eliza no longer blinked when startled. She didn't smile unless prompted, and her handwriting, once proud and cursive, had degraded into a strange, narrow scrawl. She'd been rewritten. More women began returning in that same condition, quiet, agreeable, healed. But if you looked closer, you could see the glitch, the too still stare, the programmed smile, the way they repeated the same phrases in the same tone, like a catechism burned into their neural pathways. Families rejoiced, communities praised the Ashfords as holy women of divine insight, donations poured in, the waiting list for admittance tripled. But not everyone was fooled. One man, Elias Cutter, a fur trader whose sister had vanished into the convent in 1802, began keeping a journal. He interviewed returned women in secret, noticed patterns, memorized the cadence of their answers. Every cured woman used the phrase, "It was my pride that hurt me." Always the same wording, always the same gaze into the middle distance. Cutter traveled to Boston, tried to raise concern with city physicians. He was dismissed, called paranoid. But one doctor, a German immigrant named Reinhard Holtz, took interest. Holtz had studied under Mesmer and believed the mind could be bent, broken, reformed under pressure. He read Cutter's notes and murmured one phrase, "They are reconditioning the self." Holtz would disappear 6 months later after traveling to Millbridge to observe the convent himself. His last known letter read, "The structure is not religious, it is alchemical. What they are distilling is obedience itself." Do you feel it yet? The cold breath on your neck? This isn't just history, this is infrastructure, a design we now mistake for normal. What if you've been living inside a society built on Ashford principles all along? Tell me, when was the last time you had a thought you knew was truly yours? There are records, sealed, scattered, burned, hinting that the Ashfords' work was funded, not just by donations, not just by desperate families, but by something older, something institutional. The seal appears only once, in a corner of a letter recovered from a collapsed manor in Portsmouth, a black key inside a circle of thorns. The symbol of the Black Branch, a clandestine society that predated the American Republic, rumored to be a splinter of European occult fraternities who believed obedience was the true currency of power. Not gold, not land, but compliance, absolute, unthinking obedience. And they saw the Ashfords not as monsters, but as pioneers. According to this letter, Temperance, the youngest Ashford, had been trained not in England, but in Prague, not in a convent, but in an underground academy known as Domus Mortem Mentis, the House of the Dead Mind. There, whispers say, girls were taught how to fragment a psyche like a mirror and how to place commands inside the shards. Temperance didn't just learn it, she perfected it. In the Ashford basement, there was one room not shown in any sketches, known only through scattered survivor testimony. It was called the theatre. No seats, no stage, just a chair bolted to the floor in front of a mirror, a black mirror, polished obsidian. The woman would be strapped in, lights would flicker, incantations, some called them prayers, others scripts, would be spoken slowly, rhythmically, and the woman would begin to forget, not all at once. First her mother's name, then her favorite color, then what it felt like to choose anything. Finally, her name. And when her name was gone, she was ready for the installation. Words repeated, phrases planted, new rules, new limits, new gods. One surviving woman, called Case Number 19 in Dr. Hartwell's secret log, was found wandering the coast years later. When asked who she was, she said, "I am what they made me. I remember nothing, but I obey everything." This wasn't just cruelty, it was programming. If you're still watching, you've seen enough to know this story isn't past, it's prototype. And here's your descent checkpoint. Comment the phrase, "I remember nothing, but I obey everything." Comment it twice, not once, twice. To mark that you've seen behind the veil, and you cannot go back. Ready to go deeper? Good, because the next room is locked from the inside. They called it the Chamber of Correction, but correction was a lie. What happened inside that room was the disintegration of identity, measured, charted, repeated. It was located on the second basement level, 2 floors below the chapel. Few ever saw it and remained sane. One carpenter who assisted in building the iron mechanisms hung himself 3 days after completing the work. Another disappeared entirely. Only his boots were found, laid neatly at the edge of the nearby quarry. According to blueprints never meant to be archived, the chamber had no sharp objects, no blades, no whips. That was the genius. Pain wasn't the tool, time was. Isolation, pattern, sensory imbalance. The walls were constructed of dark stone, almost obsidian, and curved slightly inward. The acoustics were designed so that even a whisper echoed endlessly, returning like a scream. Women were placed in the center of that space, one at a time, for days. No clocks, no light, no certainty. The only constants were the sounds, sometimes dripping water, sometimes a heartbeat played from a hidden phonograph. But the centerpiece was the metronome, a wooden pendulum, click, 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 unrelenting. Sister Prudence calibrated it herself. Each tick reinforced a command, a word, a phrase. You are nothing. You are quiet. You obey. You obey. You obey. For hours, days, until the rhythm didn't just echo in their ears, it nested in their bones. Those who resisted were made to watch the corrected ones. Women returned from the chamber speaking in tongues of humility and programmed virtue. Their very posture changed, shoulders down, eyes lowered, mouths still unless prompted. This wasn't just psychological torture, it was conversion, a sanctified rebooting of the human spirit into something pliable. And when one girl, Anna Louise Bishop, 16 years old, began to resist by singing loudly in défilés, they took her to a deeper chamber. No drawings exist of that level, only a single line from Dr. Hartwell's black journal. Silence reclaimed her eventually. Even song can be unthreaded. Let that sit with you. They didn't punish rebellion. They dismantled it, unstitched it, thread by sacred thread, until nothing was left but a husk in a habit. This wasn't reform. It was ritualized erasure, built on the belief that control is cleaner when the victim thanks you for the leash. In 1807, a fire broke out in the eastern wing of the convent. The official story was a faulty oil lamp during evening prayers, but survivors, those rare half-broken ghosts who had seen the inside of Ashford's Doctrine, knew better. It wasn't an accident. It was a scream. A girl named Clara Vane, age 19, had been missing for 5 weeks. Her family had paid for full reformation, the third tier, the deepest program, but she was never returned. No word, no explanation. Then one night, the East Wing lit up in orange flame and black smoke. The townspeople gathered to help, to form chains of buckets from the well, but the sisters wouldn't let them inside. They blocked the doors, smiled calmly as the building cracked and moaned. One witness, Thomas Vale, a stonemason, swore he saw movement behind the third-floor windows. A face, then a hand slamming against the glass, blood, and behind it, figures in black, pulling her away. When the fire was finally extinguished, only one room had burned. Precisely one. The rest of the structure remained untouched, almost as if the fire had been contained, designed. The sisters announced that no one had been harmed, that all residents were safe, yet 3 names quietly disappeared from the registry, and Clara Vane's family was told she had taken a vow of silence so complete she could no longer be released. A vow, or a sentence? Deacon Morrison, who had long defended the Ashfords, started to falter after that. He began asking questions in private, visiting homes of returned women, comparing letters. He found something chilling. Every woman released after treatment wrote in a nearly identical script. Same slant, same signature loops, same spacing. It wasn't handwriting, it was formatting. A signature of the same voice, ghost-written over different names. He confronted Mother Agatha, quietly, alone. He was found 2 days later in his study, a pen still clutched in his hand, having written the same sentence 113 times. They only take what you don't deserve to keep. That was the moment some began to see it. The Ashfords weren't healing pain, they were harvesting it, separating what made a soul defiant, unique, dangerous, and setting fire to it, sometimes literally. The fire didn't destroy the Ashfords, it baptized them, it cleansed the only part of the building they didn't need anymore. Clara Vane had become the lesson. By 1811, the Ashfords were no longer whispered about, they were feared in silence. Women continued arriving, though fewer returned. Those who did came back, faded, like portraits left too long in the sun. Their voices were soft, too soft, their opinions gone, replaced with placid agreement and distant smiles. And still, no one intervened. Why? Because the Ashfords had done the unthinkable. They weaponized virtue. They made obedience look holy, made control feel like safety. They turned compliance into a sacrament. They wrote sermons about it, pamphlets that circulated through frontier churches, the restoration of the rebellious feminine, on the sacred nature of silence, deliverance through stillness. Preachers across New England began quoting them in pulpits, fathers referenced them at dinner tables, and mothers began sending their daughters before they even misbehaved. Preventive reformation, they called it. One pastor's note reads, "The Ashfords offer what Scripture alone cannot, correction without stain, obedience without memory." It was the perfect storm. No blood, no public scandal, just a slow, invisible grind of willpower turned into dust. But there were cracks, always cracks. In 1812, a woman named Margaret Winslow was mistakenly released. A clerical error, they said, but what emerged from the gates of the convent was not a woman, it was a warning. She had no recollection of her past, no sense of her own name, but one thing she repeated again and again, eyes wide with terror: the chair, the black chair. It shows you what you were, and then it removes it. She wept at mirrors, she refused to sleep in darkness, and when shown religious symbols, she screamed. A group of physicians examined her. They concluded she had undergone psychological trauma beyond any known scale, but none would name the cause. Only one dared to write in his P.E. Revate notes, "Ashford conditioning is not merely mental, it is spiritual engineering." They were building something, not just obedient women, but a theology of erasure, a doctrine where free will was sin and silence was salvation. The Ashfords had become high priests of a new gospel, submission as perfection, absence as virtue, and the world, terrified of rebellion, terrified of firebrand women, terrified of thinking daughters, opened its arms. The Ashfords didn't hide their methods. They made them doctrine, and we adopted them, not with chains, but with rituals, with rules, with smiles. The question is no longer if it happened. The question is, how much of it still lives in you? There's something you need to understand. The Ashfords didn't operate in isolation. They weren't rogue zealots acting alone in a forested corner of Maine. No, they were the sharpened edge of something larger, a prototype deployed by a hidden clergy, one not of faith but of function. Their mission, reconfigure the human soul into a compliant vessel. Records, buried beneath layers of lost archives in a DC sub-library, indicate the Convent of Eternal Tears had benefactors. Signatories that don't match local churches, but rather private trusts tied to European families with no apparent reason to care about a religious site in the American wilderness. Wreaths, barons, even a sigil traced to the Bavarian Illuminate, the real one, not the parlor game version. The Ashfords were an experiment in what society would allow if obedience could be baptized, and it worked. By 1815, the term Ashford tranquility began appearing in letters between frontier physicians. It was shorthand for a woman who had been through treatment, a woman broken so thoroughly she would never again resist, never challenge, never ask why. Think about that. An entire category of human behavior reduced to a medical footnote. But here's the truly unsettling part. That same term, Ashford tranquility, resurfaces again in 1949 in the notes of CIA-funded MK Ultra psychiatrists. Buried among drug trials and hypnosis scripts are references to a 19th century compliance model with annotations on pre-modern cerebral extraction. The Ashfords had become a framework, and then a blueprint. Do you feel the thread yet? From a stone convent in Maine to black-budget bunkers in Maryland, from whispered prayers in the dark to electrodes, pills, and artificial identities. One mission, one goal: sever the self from resistance. The tools evolved. Lobotomy gave way to lithium. Ritual gave way to programming. Boo. The doctrine remained. Silence is safety. Stillness is virtue. Submission is divine. This is not just dark history. It's living architecture, and you were raised inside its walls, even if you never saw the bricks. Ask yourself, when was the first time you were told to sit still, be quiet, stop asking questions? That was your orientation, your initiation into the Ashford design, not by choice, but by inheritance. And now, piece by piece, you're remembering what they trained you to forget. They always began the same way, with kindness. That's what broke people the deepest. The illusion of care, the soft voice, the gentle hands, the warm meals. It was never chains, not at first. It was routine, predictability, a sense of being seen, of being rescued, especially after trauma. Because most of the women brought to the Convent of Eternal Tears were already wounded, betrayed, abandoned, pregnant and ashamed, or outspoken and punished, or just too curious in a world that rewarded silence. The Ashfords knew this. They counted on it. The first week was always the same: baths, fresh clothing, daily prayer, and what they called listening circles. But the circles weren't about healing. They were about exposure, vulnerability extraction. Every word spoken was catalogued, every fear noted, every memory mapped. Then the sessions began. They were never called treatments, always refinements. You weren't being punished, you were being polished, shaped, elevated. Sister Temperance led most of them, her voice calm and slow like drifting snow. She would ask a woman to recall the worst day of her life and then repeat it over and over until the edges of the memory blurred. Sometimes she would ask the same question every hour: who were you before that day? Until the woman couldn't answer, until the idea of before itself eroded. Then came the mirror, always the mirror. Every woman was brought to it alone. They'd be asked to stand before it for hours, silently, and describe what they saw. At first, most resisted, laughed, cried, refused. But over time, the answers shifted. I see someone who needs to be fixed. I see what displeases God. I see a mistake. I see nothing. And only then would the next phase begin. The whispers, the reprogramming, not shouted, never screamed, just whispered from behind them into their ear for hours, for days. Until the voice behind the mirror became their own. One former Ashford graduate, decades later, said something that never left me. They never took my body, but they took the voice inside my head that said no, and they replaced it with yes. And that is true power. Not when someone obeys you, but when they believe obedience was their own idea. It wasn't just the women who were changed. The town itself began to shift, quietly, invisibly, like a house settling into rot. Millbridge, Maine, population barely 300, became a reflection of the doctrine it tolerated. Over time you could see it in the posture of the wives, the narrowed eyes of the daughters, the way men spoke a little louder, sat a little straighter, and how everyone learned not to ask too many questions. The local pastor, once a firebrand for New England independence, began preaching sermons titled The Comfort of Order and Woman as Garden. He credited the Ashfords for bringing moral clarity to a wild, unruly coast. And the children? They began mimicking the silence of their mothers, drawing pictures without faces, playing games where the loser had to sit still and say nothing for hours, like the quiet ladies in the forest, they called it. Something ancient was bleeding out of the convent and into the soil, and no one stopped it, because deep down, many believed the Ashfords were doing what needed to be done. After all, the world was changing, the old ways were collapsing, women were thinking, speaking, moving. What if this was the cure? Even the men who doubted them feared disrupting the order more than the evil it might contain. They feared the chaos of questioning more than the silence of complicity. So they remained silent, and silence became scripture. But here's what they didn't see. The Ashfords weren't just neutralizing rebellion. They were bottling it, documenting which commands worked best, which phrases dissolved ego, which memories fractured the mind fastest, which stimuli could make a woman cry, confess, comply. They weren't just breaking women, they were mapping them, turning the human psyche into a terrain, a system, a switchboard. And they weren't doing it for God, they were doing it for posterity. One journal entry from Sister Prudence, written in a code broken only years later, reads, "They believe we are purifying sin, but in truth we are engineering hierarchy, women first, men next, all of them eventually. The will is a gear, and once you learn to turn it, the rest is just clockwork." Understand this, the Ashfords didn't disappear. Their experiments scaled, and you, modern man, with your controlled outrage and curated opinions, you may be living inside the upgraded version. By 1817, the convent had grown silent in a new way. Not empty, never empty, but efficient. There were fewer screams in the night because the need for violence had declined. The system worked too well. The Ashfords no longer needed fear to break their patience. They used certainty. Each woman who entered the convent was now given a booklet, small, leather-bound, stamped with a cross, and the inscription, Via Humilitatis, the path of humility. Inside were 64 pages of instructions, prayers, rules, and mantras, but no scripture, no saints, no God, only directives. Page 1 read, "You are here because you were wrong." Page 2, "We will love you when you agree." Page 3, "Doubt is disobedience dressed in thought." And it went on. Every sentence was a splinter, small, sharp, designed to embed itself beneath the skin of identity. Within 2 weeks, most women repeated the mantras unprompted. Within 4, they wrote new ones themselves. They were becoming the tools of their own control. But outside those walls, the Ashfords were celebrated. Articles were written in Boston papers about the miraculous peace descending upon the region. Crime was down, church attendance was up, families reunited. But what kind of peace is built on hollowed minds? Even the men began visiting, not for treatment, but for advice. They sat in the chapel with Mother Agatha and asked how to manage their households, how to correct a wife with ideas, how to steer daughters from intellectual temptation. Agatha never gave orders. She gave suggestions, like seeds. And from those seeds grew trees of obedience that shaded entire generations. But a document would surface later, hidden in a false wall behind Agatha's private quarters, a letter written in her own hand. It was addressed not to a bishop, not to a king, but to the architect. We don't know who the architect was, only that Agatha wrote with deference, the way a field commander would report to the one who drew the map. She wrote, "The subjects no longer require force. They enter the cage willingly. They sing inside it. They beg to stay. We have exceeded projection." That was the goal. Not domination, not suppression, integration. To build a world so quietly controlled that freedom becomes unthinkable, and obedience feels like home. There was a ritual called the Day of Reflection. Once a month, every woman in the convent was brought, silently barefoot, to the Hall of Stillness, a long, cold corridor lined with mirrors, not mirrors like we know them. These were distortions, warped glass, blackened edges, surfaces that didn't reflect what was, only what the Ashfords said should be. Each woman was told to kneel before a mirror that had been assigned to her. Not chosen, assigned. Then the questions began. What part of you is still resisting? What would God remove from your mind if he could? Whose voice do you still hear that isn't ours? But here's the trick. Those weren't questions. They were commands. The women didn't answer out loud. They wrote, over and over. One sentence, again and again, until it replaced the question in their mind. The sentences varied, but one phrase appeared in nearly every survivor testimony. I revoke the false self. That was the magic line. That's what broke the final seal. That phrase is ancient, older than the convent, older than Christianity. It comes from a proto-mystery school chant, used to initiate members into states of mental death before rebirth. The Ashfords didn't invent it, they resurrected it, and they applied it with scientific cruelty. After a woman completed her writing, she would be led to a stone basin filled with ink-dark water. She would read her sentence aloud, then submerge her hands, her face, sometimes her whole head, emerging gasping, blind, obedient. It was baptism in reverse, not rebirth, but unbirth. And the moment she rose from that basin, the mirror was removed. Not just the one on the wall, the one inside her. And still, outsiders believed it was therapy. Clergy praised it as innovative piety. Men from Harvard and Yale came to observe the system. Their names were noted in the Ashford ledgers, men who would later serve in education, governance, media. Yes, media. Because you don't just bury a machine like this, you export it, quietly, efficiently, like seed stock. So ask yourself, where did your mirror come from? And who told you what should be reflected there? There was one room no one entered twice. It was known only by its designation in the Ashford ledgers, Cell 5, not a cell in the prison sense, a chamber, sealed in iron, encased in the farthest wing of the lowest floor, no windows, no light. The key was bone white and kept on a chain worn only by Sister Prudence, and even she, it said, flinched whenever it brushed her skin. We only know about Cell 5 because of one woman who escaped. Her name was Lillian Emery. She was a stowaway in her own rescue, smuggled out during a linen delivery by a sympathetic servant who would later vanish without a trace. Lillian was delirious, half-starved, and spoke in riddles for weeks. But what she revealed in fragments became the most terrifying piece of the Ashford puzzle. She hadn't been sent to Cell 5, she had asked to go. That's what made it worse. The conditioning had worked so deeply that she believed she deserved whatever was inside. She said the room had no sound, but you could still hear, not through ears, through thought, echoes of yourself, all your past rebellions playing in reverse, rejections of authority, moments of doubt, every question you'd ever asked, replayed like crimes. Inside Cell 5, a woman wasn't punished. She was mirrored back into herself, but in twisted fragments. Lillian spoke of the voice, not Agatha's, not Temperance's, something older, something under the stone. It asked her questions no human would know to ask. Why did you think you were different? When did you first believe you were more than them? Who gave you the idea that your mind was yours? No torture, no flame, just the slow, surgical unmaking of individuality. She said after 2 days, she forgot her own name. By the 3rd, she couldn't remember why she'd ever resisted. On the 4th, she begged to stay forever. But something snapped. A memory, her mother's voice, singing a hymn on the garden, cut through the fog, just long enough, just enough to flee. She was never the same. She would sleepwalk, hum hymns backwards, scribble crosses inside crosses. But before she died, she left one final message carved into the underside of her bed frame. Cell 5 doesn't punish you, it forgives you, until there's nothing left to forgive. Now ask yourself, how many places in your life feel like that? And would you even know if you had already entered? You need to understand how control really works. It doesn't arrive with a sword, it arrives with comfort, with promises of peace, with systems that appear to protect, while quietly extracting the very thing that makes you dangerous, your capacity to choose. By 1820, the Ashfords had perfected their model. They were no longer just reconditioning women, they were training agents. Graduates of the convent, those who had successfully completed all 3 levels of refinement, were quietly placed into key positions in towns across New England. Seamstresses, midwives, tutors, wives of rising officials, spiritual counselors. On paper, harmless, but in reality, they were nodes. Each carried with her the full Ashford Code, not consciously, not with awareness, but in behaviors, phrases, rituals. They became mirrors for the doctrine, vessels to seed a wider program. One town recorded an outbreak of what they called holy obedience, a sudden uptick in women abandoning property claims, withdrawing from public debate and returning to traditional feminine roles. No law was passed, no sermon was changed, just silence. That's how it spreads, not through force, but through replication. There are recorded cases of children raised by Ashford graduates who never once heard their mother raise her voice, who reported being disciplined with calm sadness, who began, at the age of 6, writing prayers that included the phrase, "I revoke my will." It gets in the blood. And the terrifying part? This was all intentional. Agatha's surviving journals reveal the long game. She writes of implanting the seed of inward governance, that true success would be invisible, that no one should remember the convent, only obey its ghost. And it worked. After the convent was mysteriously shut down in 1823, officially due to structural instability, there was no outrage, no investigation. Only a quiet gratitude, as if a shadow had passed and the light had returned. But that shadow had not vanished, it had multiplied. You see it today in institutions that praise passivity, in doctrines that confuse safety with surrender, in systems that encourage you to be still, be silent, be soft. You were born into this architecture. And if you've never felt the urge to scream without knowing why, you've never seen the walls of your cage, but you're seeing them now, and the only way out is through. Comment this phrase twice below to lock your awareness. I revoke the false self. Once for the part of you they made, once for the part that remembers. The Ashfords understood something the modern world still refuses to admit. Obedience is not passive, it's engineered. Every choice you think you've made, every opinion you hold, every ritual you perform in your day is the echo of someone else's design. The Ashfords didn't need to control governments. They needed only one thing: the mind that obeys before it questions. Their final years weren't about refinement. They were about replication at scale. By 1822, they had transcribed their system into a series of 7 hand-bound volumes called The Doctrine of Stillness. Only 3 known copies exist today, 2 locked in private collections in Switzerland and Germany, and one that disappeared from a Yale professor's estate in 1958 under suspicious circumstances. But fragments survive, and what they describe is not religious. It's mechanical. Each soul was seen as a machine comprised of 5 gates: memory, desire, speech, initiative, and resistance. The Ashford process was designed to collapse each gate in sequence. Gate 1, memory, broken with contradiction. Gate 2, desire, dismantled with shame. Gate 3, speech, muted with forced agreement. Gate 4, initiative, paralyzed by ritual. Gate 5, resistance, finally shattered by compassion. Yes, compassion, because that's the cruelest part. They didn't kill your will with cruelty. They killed it with understanding, with false forgiveness, with the gentle voice that says, "You've suffered enough. Let us carry your choices for you." That's how you build permanent submission. Not with pain, but with the promise of rest. And that's where most men today are trapped. Numb, tired, overstimulated, but underawake. Not because they're weak, but because they've been told that resistance is selfish, that rebellion is ungrateful, that to want more is pride. But you weren't made to be pacified. You were made to see the gears behind the curtain. That's why you're still here, this deep in the descent. You feel the memory stirring, the part of you that never forgot, that never agreed, that never bowed. They thought they erased it, but truth doesn't die. It waits, in silence, until it's spoken again. So ask yourself now, which of your choices were actually yours? And who benefits from the man you've been pretending to be? You were not born to comply. You were conditioned to mistake compliance for virtue, and that, right there, is the Ashford signature, not in the screams, not in the blood, but in the smile you wear when you betray yourself. Because by the final year of the convent, they had learned the highest form of control, alignment, not punishment, not persuasion, but the seamless merger of obedience and identity. So a woman no longer acted controlled, she simply was. Imagine it. No inner voice shouting to break free, no part of the mind arguing with the cage, just stillness. It was called the final calibration. The sisters described it in almost mystical terms, a moment when the subject enters perfect resonance with the will of the order. She moves when instructed, not out of fear or reward, but from a deep knowing that she was made to serve. The Ashfords called such women luminaries. They were sent to boarding schools in Boston, to orphanages in Providence, to new religious orders across the early American Northeast. They raised generations, not violently, but perfectly. And now, you see their fingerprints in the unspoken rules of modern masculinity. Speak only when safe. Don't challenge the script. Numb your instincts. Trust the system, even when it breaks you. These rules were not chosen. They were installed. By centuries of luminaries replicating the code. You thought the convent was a building. You thought it burned and ended. No. The convent is now inside you. It's in every self-betrayal. Every time you abandon what you know for what you're told, every moment you shrink your spirit to fit their mold. But here's the crack in the mirror. The Ashfords made one mistake. They underestimated what happens when even a single man, just one, wakes up. Not spiritually, not emotionally, but strategically. And once you see the game, you don't just leave the cage, you dismantle it. From the inside. In 1823, the Convent of Eternal Tears was officially shuttered. The records say Flood damage, a convenient lie, tidy, forgettable, but the soil around the convent never showed signs of flood. No villagers recalled a storm. And yet, within a week, the Ashford women were gone. Not dead, not imprisoned, gone. But something was left behind. A chamber beneath the chamber, discovered only decades later when a group of surveyors, sent to assess the ruins for a new school, found a hidden staircase behind a collapsed wall. What they found beneath the foundation was not a crypt, not a laboratory. It was a vault. Inside were rows of shelves, all labeled with numbers and names, dozens of leather-bound journals, anatomical diagrams, ink-stained charts, mapping emotional reactions, phrases paired with symbols, and thousands of case files, all categorized by outcome. Each file had a final box: compliant or unyielding. The unyielding subjects were marked with a sigil, an inverted triangle with a single eye in the center, sometimes carved, sometimes burned, always hidden behind the nameplate. The researchers who uncovered the vault sealed it back up within 48 hours. One resigned the same week. One disappeared 3 months later. The third began publishing anonymously under a pseudonym, M.T. Corvus. His writings, scattered across obscure psychological journals, describe a system of will reconfiguration so advanced it made early MK Ultra files seem crude by comparison. You're starting to see it now, aren't you? What began in stone and prayer evolved into clinics and clipboards. Words became pills, pens replaced rods, but the goal remained: extract resistance. Today, they call it by softer names: compliance therapy, behavioral correction, social reintegration. But the lineage is Ashford. Its bloodline runs through think tanks, private schools, behavioral labs, and even media. Production studios, the same sequence, the same rhythm. Isolate the subject, break identity through contradiction, replace ego with language, reward silence, call it healing. And men, strong, intelligent men, are the final frontier. Because if they break you, if they make you believe the cage was your idea, they don't need chains. You'll lock the door from the inside. You'll train your sons to do the same. And you'll call it fatherhood. But not you. Not now. Because you've seen the vault. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee the design. You've been watching shadows your whole life. Shadows on classroom walls, shadows in policy, shadows in sermons, each one cast by something deeper, something older, designed not to protect you, but to reshape you. And now you know its name: Ashford. But this isn't about women. It never was. That was just the test group, the prototype, the proving ground. You, man of the West, were always the end game. Because if they could break the rebellious woman, they could do more than tame society. They could stabilize the future. But to do that, they would need to learn how to silence you. Not with prisons, with purpose. They studied what made you hunt, build, protect, resist. They catalogued it, pathologized it, and renamed it toxicity, not all at once. Incrementally, gently, through trend, not tyranny. They softened the architecture of manhood, rounded its edges, dimmed its fire. They built temples to comfort and taught you to kneel before them. Now the average man is more medicated, distracted, and emotionally muted than at any point in modern history, surrounded by convenience but starving for meaning, wealthier on paper but bankrupt in soul. And the cage? It's luxurious. That's the genius. A prison made of dopamine and algorithm, of scrolling and surrender, of podcasts that tell you you're empowered, while stealing your will in 12 easy steps. And still, they whisper, don't question the system. Don't dig too deep. Just be kind. Just be small. Just be safe. But tell me, where has safe ever led a man worth remembering? Ashford doctrine lives in every institution that tells you strength is oppression, that discipline is abuse, that rebellion is pathology. They inverted the truth. And they did it so well most men can't tell the difference between submission and self-development. But now you can. Now you've felt the tremor in your gut, that primal instinct waking from sedation. It's not rage. It's remembrance of a version of you untouched by narrative, unbroken by ritual, unafraid of exile. That's who you were before they told you who to be, and if you stay on this path, you'll meet him again. And this time, you won't apologize for him. You'll become him. There is a phrase buried in the final chapter of the Doctrine of Stillness, a phrase not written in English or Latin, but in an older tongue, a dead dialect traced to pre-Christian initiatory cults in southern Gaul. It reads, Silu threnos karu, ut nascitur sub imperium. Loosely translated, the soul does not die, it is reborn beneath the system. Understand what that means. They never wanted to kill the spirit. They wanted to harness it, because death is wasteful, but redirection, that's power. So they learned to fracture identity just enough to allow for reprogramming, leaving the shell intact while replacing the fire inside, not with weakness, with loyalty, ritualized loyalty to an invisible code. That's what made the Ashford system so dangerous. It didn't destroy will, it reassigned it. You were still driven, still purposeful, but now your purpose was given, not chosen. This is the deepest level of psychological engineering, when a man defends the very system that subjugates him because he believes it is him. You see it in modern language. I don't chase meaning, I create it. Reality is what you make it. Truth is subjective. No, those are not truths. Those are installations. You were taught them by institutions that have long since fallen to the same virus that began in stone walls in Maine. The Ashfords built their doctrine to survive destruction. They knew the building would fall, but the blueprint, that would live in every school of thought that taught you to worship adaptation over defiance. To blend, to yield, to bend so you don't break. But not you. Not anymore. Because now you feel it, don't you? That quiet hum under your ribs. That buried instinct whispering, this isn't who I was meant to be. And you're right. You were not made for sedation. You were made for war. Not with fists, not with fire, with remembrance. Of the line you come from. Of the power that's been sleeping beneath your compliance. And when you remember, you become the thing they spent centuries trying to erase. A man who cannot be reassigned. It's time to ask the forbidden question, what did the Ashfords fear? Not men with guns, not priests with crosses, not officials with warrants. What terrified them, what made even Sister Prudence keep a vial of nightshade under her pillow, was this. A man fully awake. A man who remembers the first principle, that he was born with dominion, not over others, over himself. His breath, his instincts, his thoughts, his direction. You see, the Ashfords understood something the modern world has buried beneath convenience and performance metrics, that one fully sovereign individual dismantles centuries of control simply by existing. That's the paradox of tyranny. Its systems require mass compliance, but can be unraveled by one who sees through the illusion. Not a revolutionary, not a rebel, but a man who moves without needing permission, who speaks truth without waiting for applause, who builds without borrowed vision, because such a man doesn't just resist the system, he renders it irrelevant. In the final pages of Agatha Ashford's private diary, never published, recovered from the ruins and archived in secret, she writes of a vision she had, a recurring dream. A man, nameless and cloaked in shadow, walking through the halls of their convent. Doors opened for him without keys. Walls crumbled where he looked, and where he walked, the mirrors cracked. Agatha called him the Severed Flame. She feared his arrival, not because he would destroy them with violence, but because he would make them unnecessary. And now I'll tell you what she didn't know. The Severed Flame isn't a person. It's a frequency, a mindset, an echo that awakens in men who step outside the dream, who stop begging for identity, who stop waiting for instruction, who start moving as if they remember who they are. You were trained to ignore that flame, to fear it, to medicate it, to intellectually use it. But now you feel it rising, not rage, not chaos, but clarity. And the system, it doesn't know what to do with that. Because clarity burns through control. If you've made it this far, something inside you has already changed. Not because of what I've said, words are just tools, but because something ancient in you has recognized the signal, the code beneath the code, the fracture beneath the mirror, and now you're starting to see it everywhere. That's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. The same pattern that turned Ashford doctrine into silent gospel, that turned observation into architecture, that replaced your instinct with protocol. Take a look around you. Notice how often you're offered relief, but not release. A pill for your anger, a screen for your silence, a program for your lack of direction, and always a smiling authority to remind you, this is normal, this is healing, this is how you become better. But you were never meant to be better by their definition. You were meant to be whole. And wholeness is dangerous. Wholeness asks questions like, what if my pain is a compass? What if the chaos is the doorway? What if I wasn't meant to fit, but to confront? These are the thoughts they couldn't allow, because a man who trusts his inner signal can no longer be diverted by external scripts. He can't be guilted into submission. He can't be lured into comfort. He can't be sold a softer cage. And so, over centuries, they refined their strategy. Don't destroy the masculine. Dilute it, mock it, package it into entertainment. Render it harmless through parody. Or worse, frame it as pathology. That is the legacy of Ashford. Not in a ruined convent, but in your inbox, in your search results. In every voice that urges you to compromise your edge in exchange for being liked. This is no longer history. This is happening now. And here's the final test. Now that you see it, what will you do? Not what will you feel. What will you build? What will you break? What silence will you refuse to keep? You don't need permission. You need precision, because the moment you act from the root of yourself, they lose. Let me speak to the part of you no one's addressed since you were a boy. The part that asked why the world felt false. The part that sensed masks on teachers, pastors, politicians. The part that watched the adults nod and clap and conform, and whispered, "This can't be all there is." You were right. It wasn't. But you were trained to ignore that voice, to laugh it off as immaturity, to drown it in achievement, to bury it beneath a pile of titles, trophies, and polite approval. That voice, it was your inheritance, and now it's back. Because when you stripped away the language, when you heard the cold truths of the Ashford legacy, you realized, this isn't a story about 3 women in Maine, it's about you, your mind, your patterns, your blind spots, your future. This is what they don't teach in classrooms. That power is never lost, it's only transferred. And when you abandon your inner authority, someone is always waiting to claim it. That's the world you were born into. Not evil, just engineered. An invisible factory designed to turn men into mirrors, reflective but never radiant, calm but never sovereign, productive but never unpredictable. The convent was just a prototype. Today, the Ashford doctrine lives in algorithms that learn your fears, in HR policies that punish instinct, in content that rewards passivity. It doesn't matter what your politics are. What matters is whether you still believe your fire belongs to you, because that's the final threshold. It's not enough to know. It's not enough to rage. You must choose to stop echoing, to stop submitting, to stop rehearsing safety, and start remembering your origin, the man before the system, the voice before the doctrine, the will that never asked for permission. The world does not need more followers, more healers, more nicely packaged masculinity. It needs the rarest archetype of all, a man with his own authority. Not borrowed, not taught, not sold, claimed. Because when one man does that, the entire blueprint begins to crumble. This is the part they never wanted you to reach. Because now, there's no going back. You've heard the whispers behind the mirrors. You've seen the vault beneath the story. You've traced the fingerprints from the Ashford stones to the frameworks that shape your life today. You know now, this wasn't history. This was a seed, planted in silence, watered by fear, grown in generations of compliant men too polite to confront the design. But not you. Because if you've stayed this long, it means something ancient in you has awakened. That is not coincidence, that is inheritance. So I'm going to ask you to do something most men won't. If this voice has stirred something real in you, go to the comments. Type the phrase, "I return to the fire." I return to the fire, twice. Not for me, not for likes, but because writing it makes it real. It draws the line between who you've been and who you no longer serve. Because now you understand. They never needed to imprison your body, only your belief. They didn't have to break your bones, just your initiation. The first wound of every system is the same, to make you doubt that you were born with power. But brother, look at me. You were born with fire, not the kind that burns cities, the kind that builds worlds, the kind they've tried to silence since you first asked, why? Now you've seen what they built in shadows. Now you've felt the pattern pulsing under every polite deception. And now the question turns, not what did they do, but what will you do with what you now carry? There are no more teachers, no more intermediaries, no more rescue missions. There is only the man you choose to become when no one is telling you how to be. And when that man stands in full remembrance, full clarity, full alignment with the voice they tried to erase, he becomes what the Ashfords feared most. Unyielding, unprogrammed, undeniable,